and then we'll go ahead and. Okay, so my name is Melissa Martin. I am a faculty member at the University of Illinois in Chicago. It is bright and early at 4 a.m. here that I am coming to you guys live from the States. So thank you guys all for being here. I'm really excited to share this special issue for EAR that I've been working on with my colleagues, David Smith from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology and Matthias Mallendorf from Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. I think I said that all correctly. And so we just kind of wanted to give you guys a quick little introduction. So this panel session really came about as a result of the special issue that we're editing. And really what we have an interest in is kind of locating and promoting innovative sources of data and management accounting research. And so when we put out the call for this special issue, we really left it quite broad in terms of topic area and methodology, because we really wanted you guys to speak to us. What are the sources of data, these new and interesting sources of data that you're using across lots of different types of research that you're doing? And so in doing that, we had many high quality submissions. We're super excited about what we've gotten so far. We have a number of these still in the running across lots of different topic areas and methodologies. And we hope to actually publish that special issue. If B has anything to say about it, for sure, we're publishing that special issue in the end of 2020. So you guys keep a lookout for that. I think it'll be a really interesting look into kind of the future of management accounting research. And so in kind of thinking about this special issue, and more specifically, we've spent a lot of time thinking about what could these innovative sources of data be. We wanted to come to you guys and sort of share some ideas for what these innovative sources of data might be. And so we're going to do it in sort of two parts here. So Matthias will start for us, and he's going to really talk about innovative sources of quantitative type of data that we can use in management accounting research. And then David's going to talk about more from the qualitative research perspective. What are some ways that we could think about gathering data in new and innovative methods? And so we're going to split the discussion in that way. Both presenters, Matthias and David, are going to be open to you guys asking questions during their presentation. So if you have a question, feel free to either raise your virtual hand, put the question in the chat, and I can sort of moderate that way. And then we'll save some time for some broad Q&A at the end. All right. So again, thank you all for being here. We look forward to publishing the special issue and for all of you guys to read it. So Matthias, I'll turn it over to you then.
Okay, thank you very much, Melissa, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm very happy to give us a short talk about innovative data and management accounting. And some of you might also have attended the new directions. So I gave a talk about new data there. Don't leave the session because there's no overlap. Yeah? So all slides are new, all examples are new. But it also means there's even more out there, right? So if you find this panel session interesting, send me an email. I can send you the other presentation, and even better, read the special issue once it comes out. Okay, so let me start by discussing the so-called data explosion, right? So many people have the feeling or think that we have seen a data explosion in the last decade. Last 10 years. And if you look at the numbers, then the globally generated data increased from 2 zettabyte, whatever that is, right? 2 zettabyte in 2010 to 47 zettabyte in 2020. But I would say, well, that's not actually a data explosion. It's a lot, right? It's a strong growth, but it's not an explosion. And why? Because the real explosion is just to come, right? So that is the predicted data in the next 10, 12 years. And as you can see, that's where it really is taking off. These developments raise the question, to what extent do we as management accountants, management accounting researcher, but also management accounting practitioners somehow use that data? Yeah, so, and I think that's a huge opportunity for research, but also for the profession. But we have to keep active on that front, right? Because there's so many new developments. And today's talk is the idea to share a few ideas and also maybe get some input from you, the audience. Okay, so and obviously not all this data is useful for decision making, right? So that's the real challenge here. I just picked a few examples out of the broad area of innovative new data. So some examples that I found particularly interesting for management accounting questions and topics. So on the right-hand side, you can see my agenda. I will briefly talk about images and videos, internal data information sharing from employees. The third one is smartphone geolocations. Fourth one is text mining from the web. Fifth one, very briefly, email receipts. And the sixth one is satellite data. And on the left-hand side, you can see a picture from Eagle Alpha. So Eagle Alpha is one of the data providers. Those are mostly at the moment used by hedge funds and investors. Right? So there are the most famous ones would be Bloomberg Alternative Data or Quandl. And they have thousands of data sets, and there are thousands of these companies, right? So, I guess over time, at the moment, it's more the kind of big data-driven investors that are using this data, but to some extent, this will spill over, and some of these data providers like Eagle Alpha are also now just recently starting to build use cases for companies that would then be very relevant to management accounting. Okay, so let's start with images and videos. And yeah, first thing is I think that cost for quality control should substantially decrease in the next years. Why is that? That is because, among other things, this small device you see here on the left side of this picture, so this camera, what is this? This is kind of a out-of-the-box machine learning image recognition tool. So that means the company only has to get this by this camera. And the only thing they have to do is upload some pictures of things they like, right? Like these tweets that are fine, and upload in another folder things that are not so good, right? So like these damaged pieces of this special cookie, and that's all, right? So no programming, nothing, right? So they only upload pictures, and then the rest is done by this camera and by the algorithms. So let's use some supervised machine learning to build on this these uploaded data, and then automatically classifies new data. So that means it's super easy, becoming super cheap to use advanced machine learning and image recognition. And I would say that has implications for cost management, for management approaches like Six Sigma, but probably even much more general, right? Because everything that you can somehow control or monitor with such a camera could be affected by this. So that could be one of the game changers here. Then another example, very different, but that was one of my favorite examples from recent research done by Tony Davila and Marty Guasch, a working paper. And what they did, they used cameras to record presentations of innovators. As someone who would like to get some funding for a startup, gives a presentation about his company, his startup idea, and then you can see here some screenshots from those videos. And then you can now use software that automatically detects the joints of those people. So what you can see here highlighted. So, and then this tool also can track how these people move around. Right? So then what you can create or calculate with the software, and the authors told me it's, at the moment it's still a pain and a lot of work, but I guess it's getting more convenient in the future, these tools. So what you can calculate is, for example, the area that the person presenting covers, and they call that body expansiveness. And interestingly, body expansiveness is positively correlated with proposed firm valuation and funding success. So those persons that cover more space on the stage estimate the value of their startup higher and also get more money. So that's great. So they seem to be really impressive. The not so great thing is they also have higher forecast error and lower firm survival. Right? So that seems like there's maybe our intuition about people standing strong, being kind of alpha persons in our mind is not perfect also to give funding to new startups. Right? So I think it's a super interesting use case, and many other ideas can probably follow from this kind of analysis. Okay, and then third example with respect to images and videos. So a lot of sports are now recording much more data. For example, the NBA uses cameras that records all players and the ball 25 times per second. Right? So that means you have a continuous flow of information of all the things that are going on the playground. And then they're calculating a ton of statistics. And this is one of the submissions to the special issue. So I've anonymized the authors here. And what they're arguing and find is that this kind of advanced monitoring, I mean, that's much more than has been ever possible before, right? So that this helps decision facilitating. So players can develop their strategy, how they want to play, but also potentially increases player effort. And this can increase individual performance, but they also analyze some team level things, for example, specialization, right? If you have so detailed information, then you can maybe also make some decisions about who is best in what and how you can split up tasks even better. I know there are also a couple of other papers like this currently in the making, for example, also in European soccer. And yeah, I think it's also very relevant. I'm kind of curious about the first application in companies, right? Because you could use this system theoretically also to track how employees move on the shop floor while serving customers and a ton of other things. Okay, so interesting new developments here, definitely. Good. Switching to the next topic, internal information sharing and control. And this is a very broad topic here. So kind of I put together all the internal information that are somehow novel or that are used in a novel way here. And the first example I would like to provide is from Walmart. And I call this scaling up of diagnostic use to real-time benchmarking of potentially thousands of KPIs. And what they did is they put together, like many other companies, they put together a lot of data. They call this data cafe. I don't know why. So usually it's called data lake, right? But maybe a cafe is nicer to sit and then swimming in a lake. So they have this data cafe, and the really most interesting part here for today's presentation is this example. So the system can provide automatic alerts if it detects some anomalies. And so let me read it out. So during Halloween, sales analysts saw in real time that a particular novel cookie wasn't selling at all in 2 stores, although it was very popular in most stores. A quick investigation showed that due to a simple stocking oversight, the cookies hadn't been put on the shelves. The store was then able to rectify the situation immediately. Right? In other words, the system automatically detected that there was something wrong at the individual store for an individual product, could send a notice, and then people could solve the mistake. And I think that it's a kind of drastic kind of extension of what we traditionally would think about these kind of dashboards, right? So we are all familiar with dashboards. So you have your 10, 20 KPIs, you have a traffic light, and if one of the lights is yellow or red, then the company starts investigating what to do and how to improve, right? So there's a diagnostic use of control and KPIs, but this is something kind of on an entirely new level, right? So it's massive. So individual product level, all kinds of KPIs, real time, and also this kind of automatic benchmarking is interesting, right? So here, this example, that's not that someone said, well, if we sell less than 3 packages of cookies in the morning, then we should raise a flag. No, it's just somehow the system knows from comparing one store to the other that this is something weird, right? So that cookies that sell good in one store don't sell good in the other store, right? So you can automate a lot of these kind of anomaly detections. Okay, so let me quickly see whether there are some there's some chat comment coming in. Yes, yeah, we will discuss ethical concerns also later. Sure, right? Okay, good. Yeah, so if you have something directly to the point, feel free to enter the discussion, right? So we can make this interactively, and if it's getting too much, then I will push to continue with my main story. Okay, so also conceptually, one very interesting point here is that now suddenly the headquarter has better insights than the local people, right? So that's a kind of shift in the logic. So, and that also has implications for our research on decentralization, information asymmetry, because normally we assume that the decentral units have the knowledge, and we need their input and their collaboration to get this to the headquarter. Here, the local people didn't notice that they forgot to put the thing on shelf, but the headquarter noticed because they have a better, they are able to compare the information from different store, and this kind of logic that there's more power moving to the headquarter also applies to many other settings, right? Where headquarters are now with better data infrastructures able to benchmark and to compare many local units. Okay, then let's move on. Okay, then a new topic, algorithms that guide decision facilitating use of information. So I'm not sure about your university, but Frankfurt School has a while ago introduced Microsoft Teams, right? So very useful during the pandemic. And most companies are using something like Teams, Slack, Workplace, and similar programs that somehow help to interact. And here's a nice quote from one of the guys from Slack, and he said, we have spent a lot of time building models that understand what you care about and what content you interact with. In the future, we'll take that same understanding and apply it to content you don't know about, and that could make you better at your job. And so there's something like which person should get which kind of information. And I think that to some extent that was also a management accounting domain, right? So who gets access to which databases and so on, and who do you need to provide with additional information. So now these kind of algorithms are deciding who should get what kind of information. Right? That's interesting and an overlap with what we are interested in. And then there's also, we can also take this one level higher. There's also this software called StarMind, which is kind of a meta software that analyzes all these tools like Teams, Slack, email, and whatever else you do in your company network. And here's a description. StarMind identifies who should interact more with whom and who has the highest probability of solving a particular problem. So what they do, they kind of putting all this information together, and then you can, for example, on the screen shot on the right-hand side, you can see how it works. You could write any question you're interested in. Yeah? So is StarMind a patented tool for expert identification? Then the tool tries to extract some components of your question and then automatically assigns experts throughout the entire company to your question. And then you can post this question anonymously, and those experts are getting the question, and usually they reply or someone else can reply. So that means the tool now also kind of decides who should collaborate with whom, right? So who should talk to which other person, which has implications for information flows, for organizational design, right? So you're all familiar with this discussion of functional versus divisional structures and so on. And with these tools, now we have a very different element that might change the importance of organizational structures that we as we normally think about those. Okay, good. Next one. And Melissa, can you check whether people raised their hand? I don't have the screen now, so.
Christian has a question. Christian Hoffman has a question about, can you see this one? About, can you think of any more, any applications to say more non-routine types of decision-making within an organization, something like R&D or something like we do in academia?
Yes, yeah, I will come to some examples that, for example, are about deciding about new locations for investments, a kind of strategic investment decision. Maybe that goes in the direction. Yeah? So I think we'll come to that. Okay, and if not, please talk or make a comment later after the presentation. Okay, thanks. Good. The next example that I would like to give from this kind of information sharing control perspective is the software called Mentiio. And this is like a discussion board, like an online discussion board, but it has some nice additional analytics. And we have recently introduced this at Frankfurt School for our students to help students to get engaged with each other, so we can post the question and then they can discuss sort of kind of flipping the classroom idea and so on, and getting more interaction among students. But so that's great. So one thing, great tool, but it also has quite surprising capabilities in terms of analyzing what people do. And so, for example, here you can see that this, so this is from when I just started to post a new question. So there was this one student, Laura, and I agreed to whatever she posted, right? So we have a high agreement, 100% agreement. And then this tool is also calculating automatically the thought distance, right? So here are some students, so they are pretty close. I didn't write any comment myself, so I'm kind of at the end of the scale at the moment, but the tool automatically shows you how far people are apart in terms of their opinions. I think that's a really interesting. And this all comes automatically out of the tool, right? So that could, for example, have implications for identifying people with different opinions when you have some project management and planning things. I've seen on the program, there are some studies here on escalation of commitment, right? So where failing projects are terminated too late. And I've also done some research on this topic. So in those settings, for example, reducing confirmation bias is one of the recommended solution. And to reduce your own confirmation bias, you have to find someone who has a different opinion. And this tool could kind of automatically give you a score who in your team or in your company has a different opinion on topics you discuss. That could be useful for this. Could also be useful for creative tasks, where you need to see different creative ways about thinking about things. But it could also potentially be kind of misused by executives to identify and silence some dissenters, right? So if you're the CEO here, and then there's this guy constantly at the other end of the scale, maybe you're not too happy about this thought distance if it's also an executive, right? So a lot of interesting possibilities, also potentially ethically questionable to some extent. And so this is one part, measuring opinions. And then, of course, you can also evaluate them. And the tool here is automatically generating an overall score, right? So here I have this score of 60, not too good. I didn't write much in that discussion. And this overall score somehow combines how much answers you looked, how much you have done, how often you have kind of contradicted someone in a creative or in a productive way, and so on. And then you automatically get the score. And this could be readily used for example, instead of giving grades for oral participation, you as a teacher could think about, well, maybe I give some grades that are related on how well people discuss with each other. And if we can, and this is kind of not something futuristic, you could do this tomorrow if you like. So it's already in place. And then it's only kind of one step that companies could also somehow automatically evaluate social interaction. And I mean, it's not completely new. If you think about subjective performance evaluation, then supervisors in some way always evaluate how people interact and whether they're collaborative. But this is kind of an algorithm, so it's a very different thing here. So Wim also has a question or comment, please.
Yes, one of the things you mentioned is ethical considerations, but another one is how people respond to, say, their analytical score. So you said, Matthias, that you didn't do very well here with 60 because you didn't participate much or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so will that, just like in the old office, cause you to engage in non-productive efforts just for the sake of enhancing your score? So there's ethical issues, but there's also response issues, particularly if there's an inference as to what the boss may find important for the subjective performance evaluation. So it becomes a production of effort that is in by itself picked up by the system, but not necessarily a desirable allocation of effort from an organizational standpoint.
Yeah, that's a very good comment, Wim. Thanks. Yeah, right. So of course, if companies or we as universities start evaluating people with this, then it won't take long, and they will try to find out how to perform well in the system. Yeah, for example, always giving an opposite opinion if that is rewarded by the system, even if it's not really helpful for the quality of the discussion or for the company. Yeah, so it's a good point, right? So that means there's a higher responsibility actually for those designers of those systems, and maybe not sure whether they are aware of this. But it's also a point where our research and our approach could maybe help companies to design better tools and to become aware of those potentially unintended consequences. Okay, thanks. Good. Okay, so in case you're now completely lost by the diversity of these topics, that's normal, right? I also have this feeling, but here I have one piece of structure that I can give you. So I came across this paper in Academy of Management Discoveries, and they're not management accounts, I think, but they came up with this framework of the impact of datafication technologies on organizational control. And I think that is a nice way if you start thinking about from a theory perspective, all these tools and so on, and these new data. So from a theory perspective, how can we look at some of these elements, particularly talking about performance monitoring and internal information sharing? Then these dimensions here seem to be pretty useful. For example, they say The first element is control timing, right? Before contracting, after contracting. So here I immediately see a lot of connections to the entire agency and contracting literature, right? Where it's also important when and how you do the contracting. Then the second one, targets of control, inputs versus process versus performance outputs. And then they also have norms and culture. Yeah? I guess that rings a bell also for the management accountants with inputs and process controls and so on. Or this fifth point, openness for employee participation. Yeah, so can employees somehow contribute to this data? And then that has a close link to the entire literature on participative budgeting, right? So, and then there's this point 10 reference group. So who can actually, who are you compared to with yourself or with peers? So that links to the huge literature on relative performance evaluation, RPI, and so on. And the last point, data visibility, in my mind, links to the quite recent literature on transparency, for example, of performance measures of payment across hierarchies and so on. So I think this is a nice set of structured ways how to think about all these things going on. Okay.
Matthias,
yes.
So a quick question from Thomas Gunther. What about the validity? How are we going to measure validity in probably many different ways? I don't want to interpret your question, but in many different ways related to these new data sources.
The validity in terms of whether the data is kind of true and represent, that's a challenge, right? So I have difficulties discussing this on a general level because there's so much different types of data. I mean, some of those measures are, or I guess a lot of these measures that I'm talking about are, especially if you talk about videos, imaging, and so on, they are quite, at least on the kind of the first level, kind of at face value, positions, time, they are very objective and very valid, right? And then the question is, of course, how do you interpret this kind of on the next conceptual level? It's a challenge. I don't have a kind of answer to address this for all types of data things, but it's certainly a challenge for new data. Okay, maybe you can also come to this later in the discussion with you, Melissa. I think you have also some things later to add here. Okay, good. Then, okay, and one last example in case you think, well, these modern tools, information sharing and so on, maybe that's not publishable in top journals. Well, it is, right? So there's this paper, for example, by Lee and Sandino, where they did a field experiment to investigate the effect of an information sharing app. So they were in India and they had this, so local stores would try to get some creative ways to attract customers. And what they investigated was an app that would share this information to other stores. Okay, so I think it's really cool to see that there's a huge overlap between what practitioners are interested, what you can do, and what is also published in top journals here. Good, then a completely different topic, and my kind of tour de force through different areas, smartphone geolocation. And so as you might know, right, so there are all these apps that ask you for your location. And in case you wondered, how can that, is that used by anyone? Oh yes, yeah, it is used. So, and here's one of the most interesting uses of tracking your location from your smartphone. And that is from McDonald's. And they have acquired in 2019 an artificial intelligence company for 300 million. A lot of people might have asked, what has frying burgers to do with artificial intelligence? Well, it has. Here in the screenshot, you can see here, for example, hi, at this restaurant, these things are popular. Okay, that's not very difficult. The really interesting thing is once you combine this with the individual customer. So, for example, the one idea to how to use this is if you're driving to the drive-through, right, and you're coming to the display recognizes that it's you or me, right? Then the first thing that they could do is show me products with a high profit margin based on my history. Yeah? So for me, maybe a veggie burger. Yeah? So I guess it has a high profit margin, and I might have bought that in the past. So that's the first thing, right? So maximizing profit margin based on your own history. But then that is even one even smarter idea. That is, what if the algorithm detects that there are a lot of smartphones waiting in the row, right? So if now suddenly we have a bottleneck or a capacity constraint, and not sure about you, but when I studied with Professor Günther, right? So as a professor many years ago, we had these optimization things where you would decide how to make a production decision if you have capacity constraints. And then the thing you typically do is depending on how many bottlenecks and so on, but the easiest thing to do is you try to produce a product with the highest contribution margin per unit of the bottleneck, right? So in this case, the algorithm could now switch to the highest contribution margin per minute to prepare. So maybe it now shows me a salad on the screen, because it is already pre-packaged. So maybe contribution margin is lower, but they can hand it out much faster and then get done with the bottleneck. So I think it's a very interesting application of things that we have thought conceptually for I don't know how many years, right? But now it's somehow done in real time with customers automatically. So very interesting application, I think. Okay, then now we are coming to this to one of the examples that maybe is closer to what Christian Hoffmann had in mind. So kind of more unusual, not day-to-day routine activities, and this is the strategic investment decision. So where should a company open the next store, for example? And Lowy is this kind of has stores that sell do-it-yourself equipment, and one of the biggest competitors is Home Depot, and they used this company Orbital Insights to make this decision. And what you can see here is on the map you see the yellow points. For example, here this is a location of a store of Home Depot, and the blue points are the stores of Lowe. And now you can one thing that they can do based on your smartphones is they can track where people live who bought in certain stores, right? So because they can track the movement of those smartphones. So, you know, most people who buy at this, what is it, Warrington store, live in this area. And then you see some areas that are mainly kind of regions where customers go to one company, and then there are other regions where customers predominantly go to the other company. So the blue versus orange areas, and then there are these brownish things where there's more competition, right? So customers go to both competitors. And now if you just want to make a decision about where to put your next location, you could, for example, decide, well, how about Winchester, right? So there doesn't seem to be big competition, at least not among the largest players. So maybe let's go to Winchester and open a store. Or you could be even kind of meaner and you can also analyze which store has the highest number of customers of your competitor, right? So and this company did this, right? So Orbital Insight provided a ranking which would list the competitors' Home Depot stores and how many customers they have per day. And then you might see, well, maybe this location is a store of my competitor with the highest number of customers. Why not open a Lowy store here? So kind of to do maximum cannibalization of the customers and to draw customers away from that other very successful store. Okay, good. So I was a bit surprised that this is possible when I saw this example recently. Good. Okay, so, and then there's also other ways how you could analyze strategies. So also an example for kind of non-standard decision. So more kind of strategic thing. So here you see the case where Shell collaborated with Waitrose. Waitrose is a grocery, like a supermarket company. And one day, Shell decided, okay, let's collaborate with them and put them in our store. Maybe that attracts more customers who want to buy groceries. And what you can see on the graph here is that before they did this, there was the high correlation between fuel price, the blue or dark line, and weekly users. So that means people go to Shell if the fuel prices are low. And they don't come if they are higher or less, come less, right? Maybe they go to some competitors then, or just buy lower and less in general. And after the collaboration, this correlation basically disappears, and you see that the visits become very stable. And if you can trust this analysis, then this would mean that the strategic collaboration has been successful in the way of making Shell less influenced by volatile fuel prices by having this collaboration with something that has a more stable demand. And the interesting thing is you can do this for your competitor, right? So it's not your own strategic decision. You can use the geolocation data to see if your competitor did this collaboration. You can track their customers and see how that developed over time. Okay. Good. Next, so let me check the time. Yeah, so I think I should speed up a little.
You're okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I still have a lot to come. So, but I think I guess we can also do this quicker because text mining is probably the most advanced area in kind of innovative data. So not yet fully there in management accounting, but in finance and so on. There are plenty of studies. There's also, I'm happy that later we'll also get some qualitative insights on how to interpret text from the web by David. He will talk about this. Let me very briefly show you, there's some top published papers already in the last years that use text mining. You can look them up yourself. But let me show you some examples how companies are using this. So this is a tool by DHL to do supply chain risk controlling. And basically they scrape the web in real time, and then you can select each of your suppliers and each type of risk you're interested in and see a ranking. So, and that can be easily extended also to kind of these new trends like monitoring that you're following the ethical rules, right? That none of your suppliers is using child labor, because it's such a tool. If someone were in Bangladesh, a newspaper would write child labor used, and if this is a part of your web scraping, then you could see this, right? You could get notified by this automatically. Then another very big area that is used by companies for web scraping is scraping job postings. And from this, for example, you can not only see how many jobs your competitors posted, but you can also see what kind of jobs these are. You can distinguish according to region and so on. So this gives you a very detailed approach or look into competitors. Or if you do research, then as a researcher, it could also give you a very detailed look into different emphasis, right? So where are they building up what kind of capacity and how might that have to do with their strategy? And you can also use these job postings as early leading indicator for revenue. So let's skip this, but it seems to work very well. There are many examples from these quant data providers that you can use this as an early indicator for revenue. Okay, and then the last thing that I think we haven't used yet, but would be very interesting in terms of web scraping for research also, but companies are already using this, right? So scraping the prices and the composition of products, because that gives you some insights about how many products are in a certain area competing for the same kind of demand from the customer, and what are the pricing strategies. You can also see which are the best sellers. And if that is a lot of information, then there's even much more that companies are getting. And because if you're a professional interested in this data, you don't have to scrape this from the web, but there are companies that offer email receipt data. How does that work? Well, if you're using Google Mail, for example, Google can, of course, if you've checked this box or whatever, right? They can analyze your emails, maybe anonymized, but they, for example, if you get a receipt where you have bought something as PDF, Google knows this, right? So, and then they sell this to, and there are other companies who are also selling this very detailed customer data to other companies. And here, just to give you one example, how it can be used. So this was an M&A process, also kind of non-routine decision. And here the company was interested in the average prices of the brands of the target that they wanted to acquire. Well, you can just buy this data, right, on the market. So some companies are scraping the receipts, so then they know the prices, the amounts, the customers for different products and brand, and then they can tell you, well, for your target, the average price based on the email receipt data is $14.22, and this was higher than the acquiring company's brands. So they thought, well, maybe it's a good idea to buy that company. Okay, and now my last example, and then I'm getting to the end, is very briefly satellite data. So satellite data is already used in some research papers. So in the Journal of Financial Economics, for example, here's this one. They've showed that companies are using satellite data to predict oil price. How is that? Well, you can, on this picture, you see these shadows, right? So these are oil tanks with floating roofs, and depending on how full the tank is, one part of the shadow becomes larger or smaller. And you can use this to estimate the reserves, for example, in huge harbors where the storage is happening. And in this paper, they have a very nice identification strategy because they use cloudy skies as an identification strategy to see whether this information is used. And it seems to be already used by companies. Here's how, if you want to use it, right, how that looks like. You just go to Orbital Insights, pay, and then you select the area you're interested in, right? So here it's the Samsung plant, and then you select the time, and then you see, for example, the number of employees, the foot traffic that went into this facility. And then here, this analysis, they figured out that Samsung only had kind of 1 day off per week. Yeah? So they would, for example, work from Monday to Saturday, and only Sunday would be off. And now here, they had 2 days off, right? So they switched from a 6-day work week to a 5-day work week, which has implications for the available supply of memory chips. And if you are in that area, that is very important to know. Okay, and then the last 2 examples to give you an idea on how fine-grained this information can get by now. So, for example, Sentinel satellites have measured that the Oslo train station is sinking 10 millimeters per year. Yeah, so that has obvious implication for infrastructure maintenance and so on. So 10 millimeters per year. So that's the level. And I think I also here on the first thing I had mentioned this startup which has a goal to image every square meter of the Earth every hour, right? So that's where we are going to, right? So you can see everything almost in real time worldwide if you pay for it. And this can also, for example, be used by insurance companies who can immediately see where buildings are damaged. So you don't need to send out an inspector. You can directly see this from satellites. Only 1 out of thousands of possible applications. Okay, this was a lot, but I think it was a good overview to see the diversity of potentially interesting alternative data. The problem is, so the data is growing, or with a quote from Quandl, finding a powerful alternative data set has always been a needle in a haystack problem, but now the volume of hay is growing faster than the needle count. Right? So there's all this data growth, and so somehow we have to figure out how to make use of this and what is really valuable for decision making, for teaching, for practitioners and our research. So that was it. I'm very much looking forward to questions, and I'm handing over to Melissa.
So I think we're going to pause for questions right now and let David kind of give his perspective on qualitative research and how we can get some interesting innovative data there. And then we'll open up the floor kind of broadly for questions at the end. All right. So David, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Okay, Melissa, are you able to see that?
Yep, just put it in presentation mode and we should be good.
Great. All right, great. Thanks, everyone. And as Matthias and Melissa have already flagged, my orientation, I suppose, in terms of my presentation is to focus more on the qualitative sides of management accounting research. And while Matthias, I think, has done a wonderful job of giving a very broad overview of all the possibilities that may be inherent or may exist in terms of new technology, my focus has been to take a slightly more narrow perspective and to focus on just 3 or 4 areas in which I think that we can potentially advance our understanding of management accounting phenomena, and particularly with respect to using qualitative research techniques, which I guess very much fits with my own research background. And so the first of those that I'm going to talk about is about netnography. Now, netnography is not a brand new technique in accounting. Jekyll and Carter published the first study in accounting using a netnography back in 2011. But to my understanding, there's only been around 3 studies at this point that have used ethnography in management accounting research, and I think it has significant potential. And so what I want to spend a little bit of time with you now is outlining why I think that's the case. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the technique, you can see the definition there from Kozinets 2002
David,
to,
David,
yes.
sorry, we can only see, I think you're sharing the opposite screen, so we can't see the presentation of the slides, only the main PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, just bear with me for a moment here. Okay, what can you see now, Melissa?
The PowerPoint program, not the presentation.
Oh dear. Okay.
If you stop sharing and then share again, you can select which screen, right? So you can just select the screen where the full presentation is available.
But then if you don't have any secret notes in your notes, then you can carry on. I think we can still see this slide.
Yes, it's also
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see the current slide now, slide 4.
We can.
Yeah, we can. And yeah, I would just carry on like this. It's fine.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any secret notes, so. And so the definition from Kozinets, who is a marketing professor who's been a leader in the field here, is that ethnography is a qualitative research methodology that adapts ethnographic research techniques to study the cultures and communities that are emerging through computer-mediated communications. So as the name suggests, we're really talking here about an ethnographic approach to an online community, where we're talking about users or members of a virtual platform and the ethnographic study of their behavior. And so the focus of that is often on text, but can also include things like images, videos, etc. And sorry, has that moved on to slide 5 now?
It has not. So you're just going to have to click down through the left panel there, I think, for us within the program.
Yeah. Sorry, the problem that I have is that my mouse has ceased to respond to the screen that actually is the one with the slides on it. So that's making my life somewhat
Or you can just
difficult.
stop the presentation exactly and just go from there. Perfect.
There we go. And so, as I said, the focus is often on text, but can also include things like images, videos, etc. And so it's a little bit different in terms of approach to the text mining approach that Matthias was talking about in his presentation, because as I've already, I guess, alluded to, and as Ingrid Jekyll makes clear in her study in Financial Accountability and Management, which is a review of and a guide to ethnographic research in accounting, it's not purely about the downloading of material from the net. So it's not web scraping, it's not data mining in terms of text off the internet. It is, as I said earlier, a study of an online community. And so neither is it using the internet to conduct surveys or to collect interview data mediated via email. It's none of those things. It is as I said, an ethnographic approach to the study of an online community. Having said that, there are differences in approach where the researcher can take more of an archival view. That is, they can study prior posts, for example, that have been made by the community, or they can take a more active view which I guess is more, traditionally associated with the ethnographic approach, where they essentially become part of the community. They sign up, they engage with members of the community, they adopt an online persona themselves, and freely exchange discussion with other members of the community. As I flagged earlier, there's only around 3 studies in management accounting at this point that have used netnography in management accounting despite its benefits. And so then I guess that invites the question, well, what are the benefits of this technique? And I guess the most obvious benefit of study of online communities is that there is a wealth of data out there, and that data can be accessed at any time from anywhere. And living in a city as I do, which is about to go into its 4th lockdown in the last year, the idea of being able to access data at any time from anywhere and not having to travel to get it is something that sounds quite appealing. In addition, online community members, as you would be aware, can represent a broad range of views. They can be from many different cultures. They can be from anywhere in the world, really. So you've got access to a global community and, as I said earlier, an absolute wealth of data. And in terms of access, the access to data and the views of participants is extremely easy. So there are significant advantages or potential benefits associated with the netnographic approach. And so in terms of the management accounting research that has been produced so far using netnography, perhaps the best known study is that of Jekyll and Carter 2011, who studied TripAdvisor. More recently, a study in management accounting research where I was one of the authors studied IMDb. And I was having part of a conversation with Baha before the session started, where he was asking about, well, what is accounting? Accounting seems extremely broad. Well, that particular study looked at how potential movie viewers use IMDb and other sources of information in making decisions about which movie they end up going to see. So you could argue that's perhaps quite at the margin of what constitutes accounting. But certainly the point there was around how potential consumers of film, different sources of information, how they responded to conflicting information about the quality of a movie that they were planning to see. So if the IMDb score was low, but it had positive reviews, how did they wrestle with that competing information, for example? And more recently, a AAAJ paper by Alexandrov looked at participative budgeting in a Russian municipality. Jekyll and Carter's study was a bit different to the others in the sense that they took more of an active role to their netnography, whereas the 2 studies listed at the bottom there, and certainly the one that I was involved in, the 2017 study, adopted more of a passive approach to netnography, taking more of an archival view, going into the site and looking at posts or discussion boards that were already in place and analysing that information that was there, not directly engaging with participants or adopting a particular persona or anything like that. In our case, in the study of the Internet Movie Database, that decision was really driven by the functionality of the site. We were interested in looking at the reviews that were posted online there and the scores for individual films. So it wasn't really about engaging specifically with the other users of the site, and what we were looking at were the movie reviews rather than in an online community, for example, where there might be a discussion forum where individual users directly interact with each other. In the case of the 2 bottom studies there, the Bielecki et al. Study and the Alexandrov et al. Study, both of those used netnography as a complement to other techniques. In our study, the 2017 study, we also used interviews, and I believe from memory, the Alexandrov et al. Study did the same. One of the questions, I guess, about netnography is around, well, how do you know that people are who they claim to be on the internet? And while there is one school of thought, well, given that you're studying an online community, it doesn't necessarily matter if they truly are who they purport to be or not, because if you're studying the community, it's who they purport to be that's important. There is also the issue, I suppose, about the extent to which the views that people might hold online correspond to the views that people in the real world might hold, depending on the research question that you're investigating. And so we found the use of interviews quite useful in that regard to provide, I guess, a form of triangulation in terms of the as compared to the data that we were observing on IMDb. And so netnography, I think, is fascinating as a potential method because it throws up a whole bunch of really significant ethical or legal questions. And in terms of ethics, the question that it really throws up first and foremost is what is the responsibility of the researchers undertaking the netnography? So if I go into an online community and I adopt a persona and I engage with other participants, what am I required to do there ethically? Do I need to divulge what I'm doing, that I'm actually undertaking a research study, what my motivations actually are? So that's one question. It does depend there, as I was alluding to earlier, on the type of netnography that you're undertaking. In the case of the Bielecki et al. Study that I was talking about earlier that I was involved with, we were only accessing archival posts, so posts that had been made previously. So we weren't directly engaging with the online community, as I said. But in circumstances where you are, I think that throws up some potentially interesting ethical issues there. A second big question that I think is raised by the use of netnography is, should contributors to a public website or discussion forum reasonably assume that their posts could be reported in an academic study? And I think that's an excellent question that doesn't necessarily lend itself to a very straightforward answer. And then I guess a broader question, and this applies potentially to web scraping and data mining approaches as well, is how much reporting of information from online sources constitutes fair use for copyright purposes. So a legal issue to throw in there, along with a bunch of potentially significant ethical considerations as well. What I wanted to get to, though, is thinking about the potential applications of this technique for management accounting research and some future opportunities that may be present that would lend themselves to being studied using netnography. And something that I've been interested in my recent research has been the proliferation of league table style ranking sites, of which, of course, IMDb is one. But certainly in Australia, and I'm sure Europe is very much the same, there are plenty of government-based websites where you can get rankings across a number of professions, whether it be government schools or doctors or any of those kinds of things. And given that there is this, as I said, proliferation or high incidence of these kinds of ranking sites, there are also often discussion forums that either operate separately or sometimes even blog sites that are actually connected to these ranking sites to allow members or participants to discuss the rankings and what it all means in terms of which school we should send junior to or anything like that. And so I find this very appealing in terms of thinking about the kind of research that I do, I suppose, in terms of this giving a window into how these rankings potentially affect behaviour. Now, clearly, we wouldn't be talking about the first study in this area because we know there have been a number of studies on how these league table style ranking sites affect behaviour. But I think what is interesting is to think about how people use this information in the presence of other competing or conflicting information. So if I see that my proposed school that I'm sending junior to is ranked low on the My Schools website, but I have testimonials from a number of friends and former students who rate the school highly, how do I put all of that information together in terms of making an assessment about where I might send my child to school? Another thing that's possible to study in terms of discussion forums or blogs around these websites is discussion about the composition of these rankings or measures. People potentially debating what's included or what's not included. How persuasive do people find the metrics? What other information apart from the rankings or ratings themselves do they consider in making decisions about where to send their child to school or which specialist to see for their medical complaint, so on and so forth? And another interesting question, I think, and this is also raised by Jekyll in her 2021 FAM paper, looking at a different context, is thinking more generally about whether online discussions about these accounting-related issues are indeed consequential. Do we see any change in the behaviour of the relevant actors who run these sites or operate medical clinics or operate schools based on the conversations and themes that come up in these discussion forums or blogs? And so moving away from netnography then, I wanted to move on to focus on a second key area here in terms of possibilities for qualitative management accounting research. And as I flagged earlier, I'm interested in just looking at a small number of specific areas. And so a second one of interest to me is around the interplay between accounting and emotions in management accounting research, which has become a popular technique probably over the last 8 or so years. Bodker and Chua's 2013 paper in AOS was certainly a key paper in the area, which then spawned subsequent interest. I've been involved in another paper, the Chennault et al. Study 2017, also in AOS, where we also looked at aspects relating to the link between accounting and emotion. And given that this is a European Accounting Review Symposium, it would be remiss of me not to mention the excellent review article by Repening et al. 2021, which has recently been accepted at European Accounting Review, which reviews that body of work on accounting and emotions in management accounting research. So clearly, given there is a review paper in the area, which I think is excellent in terms of not only reviewing the state of the art in that space, but also highlighting potential new areas for research. Despite all of that interest, it's not necessarily clear to me that we're very good at capturing emotion in our studies. And so to say a little bit more about that, essentially, when we conduct a qualitative research study, we obviously typically undertake interviews, we undertake observation as a general rule as well, we might attend meetings. And so when we then go back and then report on the results of our study, we would typically liberally quote the individuals that we spoke to in the field as in an effort to develop some of the thick descriptions, which are so keenly sought by readers, reviewers, and editors. However, I'm not sure that we necessarily do a great job of always being able to tap in to people's emotions beyond reporting what they actually say, which is not necessarily always the same thing. And so what I wanted to talk about here, in addition to identifying some more, I guess, leading edge or perhaps even bleeding edge techniques that are technologically focused, I also want to get a little bit old school, I suppose, here by talking about a new approach, but one using very old technology, and the technology being a pencil and paper. And so what we're seeing starting to emerge outside of accounting in terms of qualitative methods work has been research that has highlighted the desirability of getting interviewees to draw their feelings. Now, this is something that's potentially might strike you as odd. It might even be a little bit confronting as a qualitative researcher to think about the possibility of you going into an organization and sitting down with the CEO and then saying, well, by the way, here's a pencil and paper. Can you please draw how you're feeling? But it is something that is actually starting to be used in literatures outside of accounting. And one of my former colleagues at the University of Queensland, April Wright, who's a well-known management scholar, has started doing some work in this area. And a recent working paper that she's currently working on is the study of the perceptions of a relationship between and the rest of the hospital before and after a regulatory change. And so what April has done as part of this study is to get 77 doctors in around 12 emergency departments to basically prepare drawings to illustrate how they were feeling about the nature of that relationship between them in the emergency department and the rest of the hospital pre and post that change. And they produced a variety of drawings, things like gates and walls or barriers, garbage dumps, theme parks with roller coasters, to reflect their feelings or emotions about the nature of the change pre and post, if you like. And so that's, I guess, as I said, a fairly old school way in terms of technology that we can potentially tap into people's emotions. And in terms of analysing visual data, we already have a number of accounting studies, of course, that focus on the interpretation of visual data. The work of Jane Davison comes to mind. Also, one of my colleagues, Lee Parker, has done some work looking at photo elicitation in accounting research as well. So we already have the tools or techniques to interpret visual data. So it strikes me that this technique that's being used outside of accounting potentially may have some use within accounting. From a more technology-focused perspective, more recently we've seen the ability of machine learning techniques to detect emotions through text, and artificial intelligence techniques to detect emotions displayed by people on videos and in photographs and that kind of thing. I would regard those techniques at the moment, based on my limited research into their use, as being perhaps somewhat more bleeding edge than leading edge at this stage. Quite simply, at this point, I'm not sure the technology is really necessarily that skilled at detecting emotions accurately. The results do seem to vary somewhat depending on the groups that are being studied. Particularly, research in this area has tended to show that some cultures are more difficult to read, or for the artificial intelligence techniques to read in terms of accurately detecting their emotions, than others. So I think we're perhaps a little way off that being something we can really strongly rely on at this point, but I do think that's potentially an important way forward in terms of the future. And so connected to this idea of capturing emotions is capturing non-verbal cues or communication more broadly. And again, getting back to what I was saying earlier, I was talking about the fact that when we do our qualitative studies, as I said, we interview people, we observe practices, we read company documents, we sit in on meetings if we're allowed to as well, and potentially get those meetings transcribed as well. But what, again, we don't necessarily pick up that well, at least not directly, are modes of non-verbal communication. And going back to Gordon, 1980, a number of modes of non-verbal communication have been identified. Proxemic, which, as the term suggests, relates to proximity, communicating attitudes through the use of interpersonal space, either moving closely towards somebody or hanging back. Chronemic, which relates to the pace of the speech and the use of silences. Kinesic, which relates to how we move around, our body movement, our posture, etc. And paralinguistic, which relates to variation in voice tone, volume, the pitch of our voice, etc. Now, we know that all of these play a key role in communication. However, again, when we write up the results of our qualitative management accounting research studies, we don't necessarily see these non-verbal techniques coming through strongly. We tend to talk about them with our fellow interviewers and potentially think about that in the context of the data that we're conducting. But then when we go and put all of our data into NVivo and then code it, my concern is that sometimes the non-verbal communication aspect of that, or the cues, get stripped away, and we end up focusing to a very large extent on what was said rather than what was communicated non-verbally. And so there has been a framework or a matrix that's been for assessing non-verbal communication by, I'll try this name, but I apologize in advance if I get it wrong, Onwig Boozy et al. 2010. And essentially what we see here in what is a matrix with the emotion running down one column and then I guess a continuum across the top in terms of the degree of the non-verbal communication, where we have on the left-hand side here adapters, which is the low end in terms of non-verbal communication, and symbolic gestures, which are at the high end in terms of non-verbal communication. So to make that a little bit more clear, when we talk about adapters right at the pretty much the 0 point of the non-verbal communication scale, we're talking about non-verbal communications that aren't typically considered as being indicative of meaningful gestures. So maybe if I was to scratch my shoulder or just, you know, brush my nose or adjust my glasses, we wouldn't necessarily consider those as meaningful in terms of trying to convey anything to the other person that we're speaking to. Whereas on the other hand, symbolic gestures up the high end, hand configuration. So I might use a hand symbol to say, okay. And obviously we know these gestures vary significantly across cultures. I might use other symbols as well, or I might use my face. I might laugh, I might pull a face, I might wink, I might close my eyes. And we have lexical movements which in the continuum sit somewhere in the middle. They're not the very large symbolic kind of gestures, but they're more than just those gestures that aren't meaningful either. They sit somewhere in the middle. So I found this framework or matrix kind of useful in the sense that it gives us an ability to actually assess and meaningfully take into account non-verbal communication as well. And given that we all know that non-verbal communication forms such a major part of overall communication, it's kind of interesting that when we report on our case findings in qualitative management accounting research, we tend to pretty much ignore largely non-verbal communication. Now, in terms of connecting back to the special issue, I wanted to finish my little spiel here today by drawing on a technique that's actually used in one of the papers that has been submitted to the special issue. And so again, similar to Matthias when he was talking about one of the papers in his presentation, I won't identify the authors here, but I won't tell you what the topic is about because it's not relevant for the purpose of this conversation. But what I think is particularly interesting in terms of the innovative use of data sources in qualitative management accounting research is the use of vignettes in interviews. And so what they've basically done is to present their interviewees with a vignette, and then they've conducted interviews asking people to respond to that set of information contained in the vignette. And I think we can probably imagine what the advantages are if we undertake qualitative research. I'm sure if you're a qualitative researcher, you've probably sat around with your colleagues many times and thought, wouldn't it be great to study X? But then, you know, can we find an organization where X is there and is significant? And when we go into the field and start interviewing people about X, is it going to be salient to them? Is it going to be important in their responses? So sometimes we might have a great idea about a qualitative study that we want to undertake, but we can't necessarily find a good case context in which to conduct that study. The advantage of using vignettes is it allows you to basically take the context with you. You can design the context exactly how you like it and then provide it to the interviewee. And so it allows the interviewee then to comment meaningfully on a hypothetical situation and potentially provides them, assuming your vignette is appropriately designed, with a detailed and rich account that relates to the topic that you want to investigate. And in so doing, gives you as the researcher some degree of control over the subject being investigated. Now, obviously, some of you may be thinking, well, I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced about whether this is a good idea or not. Some of the things that you might be thinking about are, well, we tend to think of qualitative research as allowing us to get a significant dose of reality, a big, thick slice of organizational life as it's really occurring. And often when I hear colleagues indulging in methodological wars with other colleagues, field researchers or qualitative researchers might compare themselves to their experimental colleagues and say, well, you know, our research is better because we investigate real world phenomenon. And so for those people who hold that kind of view or mentality, perhaps using vignettes in qualitative research might be seen to deviate too far from what, in inverted commas, might constitute reality. There's also, of course, the possibility of social desirability bias in responding to vignettes as well. It may be possible, depending on how the vignette's designed, for the interviewee to seek to guess how the interviewer might expect them to respond and might essentially seek to respond accordingly. So the use of vignettes is not without potential perceived limitations, at least, but I think it is at least an interesting tool potentially to extend the skill set and the toolkit, I suppose, that we as qualitative researchers take into the field. And so I'm going to end my presentation there. Thank you for your patience with my technological struggles. I'll stop sharing my screen and then I'll hand back to Melissa.
Great. So we have a few minutes left, and I'd love to have you guys ask some questions that are on your mind. And if there aren't any, I of course have a few to spur some conversation, but I would love to make sure that we've addressed anything that you guys have questions about. So feel free to raise your virtual hand or put something in the chat. So perhaps while you guys are thinking of some questions, one thing I'll ask of the two gentlemen who've presented here today is, it was very positive, both of your presentations, about kind of things we could do with innovative data. And so I wondered if maybe you could comment on some of the potential risks that might be associated with pursuing one of these innovative data sources. So those might be a company deciding at the last minute you can't publish with the data that they're using, or like David mentioned, something about you've scraped data from LinkedIn and you violated somehow copyright information there, or data integrity issues. No one can verify that you didn't just sit in a room and make up all of this data, right? So how do you approach this data, given that there are obviously some risks compared to the type of research we're typically used to doing?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first if you like, Matthias. I think you've raised a number of important considerations there, Melissa, and the short answer is that there's no obvious answer or response to those. I think sometimes when we innovate, we do need to take a risk, I suppose. And so in terms of the integrity of the data, well, I think it depends somewhat on the context. And so it's difficult to kind of answer that, but data integrity is certainly an issue with, you know, many of the data sources we've identified today. I think for me, a significant risk that perhaps we haven't necessarily spoken about before, at least in the session tonight, is around the risk of getting your innovative paper and your innovative data set or data technique past two reviewers and an editor. And so I think there is some risk there as well whenever you use these new techniques for some of the reasons you're describing, because we don't necessarily know as much about the data that emerges from them in the same way that we might about more tried and true conventional techniques. And so I think there is an element of risk there. And so I guess it depends a little bit on your risk profile and where you are at your career stage to some extent as well. And I can see a question there in the chat, which kind of highlights some of these same issues as well. Do you see a risk that the excitement for new data will lead to the production and publication of a lot of studies based on methodological errors? I would guess probably not, because I think obviously we have this special issue here where we're placing a particular focus on innovative data sources. But I think in general, we know that editors and reviewers often take a fairly conservative path. And if they haven't seen the kind of data set or what you're talking about previously, there's going to be a high bar there, I think, in terms of satisfying them that what you're doing is indeed actually legitimate. But I'll stop there and allow Matthias to respond.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, let me extend maybe the related thoughts. So in terms of risks for researchers, yeah, first I can completely agree with this risk that people start doing things that are not allowed legally. Yeah? So I had a project with some data science students, and they, after 2 days, after they want to start, they already came back and said, yeah, we have scraped LinkedIn and Xing for all graduates of Frankfurt School to track their success in their career, right? And then I said, that's amazing for the school to know, but are you sure that's allowed, right? So please show me some proof. And they went back. They came back later one day and said, yeah, that's allowed. We found some website which said it's allowed. And said, yeah, but are you really sure? And then they came back again. Yeah, and then maybe it's only allowed if it would be publicly available without logging into LinkedIn. And then I said, but really, yeah, that's probably the law in the US, right? If it's publicly available, it's accessible. But then I think according to European data protection regulation, it's much more strict, right? So under that regulation, I think you need to have the written approval of every person that you have scraped data to use it for your research, right? And then they stopped the project, but they had already done it, right? So that's that shows that yeah, much more is possible than is allowed at the moment. There's one thing. Then a second risk, I guess, is and that is also related to the question in the chat, right? So with the methodological errors, I think we need to find the right balance, right? I see some PhDs that I think are over-investing now in terms of machine learning skills and forget the research contribution, right? So they spend months and months on learning very sophisticated data science skills, which is great, I think, but then they come with a result where I think, well, that's not publishable, right? So what's the story? What's it interesting? And so on the other hand, I think we should also not ignore those techniques, right? Because companies are using them already, as I showed in my research. So we somehow have to find the right balance between understanding enough to have some good judgment and somehow using it without over investing. And I guess it's, in a way, it's similar to econometrics and so on, right? They also, yeah, probably people are doing some mistakes. Most of us are not experts, but there's kind of a common standard that is evolving over time, and I guess the same will happen with these new data sets. But we have to work on that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, Christian, to your question about, isn't this the same as maybe doing field research where you have an NDA? And I think it is in a lot of ways, but I think one thing we have to be concerned with is what are those ways in which it differs? So maybe we need to have signed contracts with a data company. Maybe we need to keep all email communication. Maybe we need the manuals of the data for which we're downloading to be able to send in to an editor, something. So I think we're going to need to think ahead a little bit as we enter into these projects, things like Matthias was saying. Maybe we need some kind of agreement with LinkedIn signed before we can, submit that kind of data. So I think there are just things we have to think ahead a little bit about in the publication process, more than just the collection of the data at the front end. All right, yeah, we have six. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, can I quickly jump in there, Melissa? I think in terms of data integrity, there's a couple of issues there. There's certainly the one around, as you say, kind of giving the editor and the readers the assurance that you didn't just make the data up. But I think there's also integrity in terms of actually the accuracy of the data as well. And so some of the issue with some of these more, I guess what I described as bleeding edge techniques today, is that we can't necessarily ensure that the data being provided is necessarily accurate. So I think there's probably a couple of issues there in a couple of ways in terms of thinking about data integrity that are relevant there as well. Sorry, I'll stop there.
No worries. So we have about 5 minutes left. I've been instructed we must end exactly on time. So maybe we have time for one or so more questions. Would anyone like to raise their hand and ask something, or to put something in the chat? So then I'll just leave the guys with one more question here, which is, you've each talked about your own area, right, in which you can come up with these new data sources. But it seems to me in a lot of what you're talking about, scraping text data, analyzing text data for emotion, might this be sort of a way to bridge some more traditionally ethnographic types of techniques with more traditionally quantitative type of data to sort of bridge this gap a little bit between the two? So I'll let you guys discuss.
Maybe I start because I guess David will have more to say. So in general, yeah, I think that's in my mind. So I'm a quantitative researcher, so I have to interpret my words with caution regarding the qualitative community and topics. And certainly there are also different types of research traditions. But I think there's this new kind of way to analyze, especially text data, right? So natural language processing, but also maybe potentially emotions, if that also counts for qualitative data, as David showed. That for me, that would be a great opportunity to somehow bridge the gap, or we could also see completely ignorance at the moment, right, between the quantitative and the qualitative streams. So I would be very happy to see some qualitative topics done somehow with analysis of spoken words or written words or whatever, and kind of with a quantitative spin. So I would really love that. I think that would enrich most research traditions potentially. David.
Yeah, look, I agree. I think in an ideal world, we would see that collaboration. I suppose I take a pragmatic view on these things and say, well, there's probably been a lot of opportunities over time for that gap to have been bridged previously, and this is another one of those opportunities. But in addition to using potentially techniques that might converge, there is also the issue of paradigms and literatures and all those kinds of things, which at the moment probably don't converge so well. And so while ideally I would love to see more of that convergence that you're describing, I guess I would have to say I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, but there are some fields where there's a potential overlap, right? So for example, this literature on coercive pressure and so on, and imitation of companies, I think that's there. I already see kind of the first attempts to somehow bring those traditionally more sociological concepts to somehow combine this with more quantitative approaches. Yeah, but
yeah, certainly, and I think we're probably in a better space as a community on that front in terms of attempting to move towards convergence than maybe we were, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But it's an ongoing project, I think.
So one other thing I guess I was thinking of when in kind of your response to both of those is, have you thought at all about any research going forward or databases going forward that might be useful to investigate how this sort of pandemic shock and moving to a virtual world has altered the way that we think about research or the way that firms think about their employees or control systems or et cetera? Is there anything in kind of these innovative data sources that you've come across that would really help us to get some more insight on those changes?
Well, I came across, not personally in terms of using it, but I mean, the COVID, I think, was used by practitioners big time to use new data technologies, right? So one of the German consulting companies, I think Horvath and Partners, who were doing management accounting consulting company, they developed a huge COVID cockpit, right? So where they used web scraping and all kinds of things to analyze data around the world about the development of COVID, right? So on restrictions, where could you do business? How are companies getting out of the lockdown and so on? So yes, that is certainly used a lot by practitioners. There are also studies that measure travel, so how people move to capture the end of lockdowns and so on. I haven't seen a research application. Well, I think there are now coming a lot of papers that use COVID as shock somehow, right? So, but in management accounting, I'm kind of core management accounting, I'm not really aware of a study yet, but probably something will come.
So an interesting place for lots of us to kind of continue researching and thinking about how technology can affect us in our research and management accounting, both on the qualitative and quantitative side. So we thank you so much for your attendance today and your attention. We really hope that you guys are excited for the special issue and that you take a look at it when it comes out. And if you have any questions, the slides will be made available through the portal. And any other questions, feel free to email any of us directly. So thank you so much. We appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thanks for